Final Fantasy XV has received a decent amount of backlash due to the lack of diversity within its roster. For the most part, you will be going through Final Fantasy XV playing as 4 Chocobros. Every now and then there is a guest character that will be present that switches things up, but that's only going to be on occasions here and there. For me personally, diversity has rarely ever been a selling point from within a game. In a lot of games, diversity is there just for the sake of diversity. If I was to actually care about diversity, it would be because that's integral to that character. It's something that's vital to that character, and or it could be something that enhances the world building of the world. The Final Fantasy franchise has had a very long running history of having fairly diverse casts that the player can enjoy or hate to their own discretion. If diversity is a big selling point for you, that is perfectly fine. I'm just not on the same fence as you. Final Fantasy XV is not the first of its kind within this franchise to use this type of setup. Back during the PlayStation 2 era, a game by the name Final Fantasy X-2 originally casted an all-female playlist. And when I had played X-2 back in the day, I definitely got Charlie's Angels vibes from it. Going back to Final Fantasy XV, some people make the argument that the guest characters in that title should have been made to be permanent characters, and I personally cannot agree with this. One of the characters had their hands tied up with something else. There was another character that didn't really seem to have a set allegiance to anybody, in my opinion, and the other character did not have the combat experience to be able to join for the whole entirety of the time. I want to make the argument that due to Final Fantasy XV's lack of diversity, it actually strengthened the narrative aspect of telling a story of bonds through the means of brotherhood, and I do feel this is one of the best executed parts of Final Fantasy XV, and I believe a lot of other people will agree with me as well. Another thing to take into consideration when you're wanting to add more characters into a game, I will bring up a past example that Mr. Tabata had actually worked on himself. Final Fantasy Type 0 has 14 playable characters, and while this is a diverse cast, some characters overshadow others because they're not all in the same level playing field. Characters like Queen, Seven, and Ace in that title overshadowed characters such as Sync from what I have personally experienced. That's not the case with Final Fantasy XV, as every character has their own unique traits. They all feel like they're on a level playing field with their own pros and cons. Ever since the release of Final Fantasy XV, there have been quite a few sentiments online in regards to Final Fantasy XV being an incomplete game. Me personally, I do not agree with such statements. Even if I were to look at Final Fantasy XV by itself, it does have a definitive beginning, middle, and end. But I will say that Final Fantasy XV, as a more accurate statement, is a fragmented experience. The story of Final Fantasy XV is divided between its core game, Brotherhood, KINGSCLAIVE, and even possibly to a lesser extent a King's Tale. While you definitely don't need to consume these other properties to understand the basics of what goes on within Final Fantasy XV, it does definitely enhance your understanding. I think something that could have eliminated a lot of these comments is if somebody prior to playing Final Fantasy XV had some type of pop-up message saying, hey, welcome to Final Fantasy XV. We do recommend that you watch Brotherhood and KINGSCLAIVE prior to playing the game in order to have a more enhanced experience. What this would have done essentially was this would have reduced those type of comments while at the same time bringing more attention to Brotherhood and KINGSCLAIVE. Another reason why the comment of Final Fantasy XV is incomplete gets thrown around would be due to how the title was when it was still Final Fantasy Versus 13. Not everything transferred over from the Versus 13 over into Final Fantasy 15. This is not a unique thing to Final Fantasy 15. The longer your development time period, not cycle, but time period is for a title, the more likely there are going to be significant changes. This is a very common thing within the gaming industry. There have been many games that have come out that have been different in their final version in comparison to what the original concept envisioned. Final Fantasy 15, because it's been more open and more well known, is just getting bashed because of this, and I do feel like it's unfair, especially when there were trailers in the past that did indicate that this is something that's in development. Things may be subject to change. Another reason why Final Fantasy 15 is incomplete gets thrown around is due to the fact that there have been story-based DLCs that have been released for Final Fantasy 15. Episode Gladio, Episode Prompto, and then Episode Ignis that will be coming out at the end of the year. My personal viewpoint on each of these pieces of DLC is I do not believe these were being worked on during development of Final Fantasy 15. What I believe is that these existed in concept, but were not actually in development. For Tabata to ask everyone to be patient enough and wait a little bit longer for Final Fantasy 15 to come out indicates to me that they probably did not have the sources to work on other projects within the Final Fantasy 15 universe, such as these 3 pieces of content. There has definitely also been comments along the lines of either KINGSCLAIVE and Brotherhood should have been incorporated into Final Fantasy 15 a lot more than what they have, or the other one of Brotherhood and KINGSCLAIVE should not have to be consumed in order to enjoy Final Fantasy 15. Brotherhood and KINGSCLAIVE are enhancement pieces to the story of Final Fantasy 15, and while they are very integral and important, they are not necessary to watch in order to understand what takes place within Final Fantasy 15 on a general level. For those of you that believe that Brotherhood and KINGSCLAIVE should have been incorporated into Final Fantasy 15, a big part of the reason why that did not end up happening was simply because they would have been too big of projects to incorporate into a single game. Also, there was a major time restraint on this as well. If they were to have done these pieces within the game, there would have been 2 things that would have happened. One, the development cycle would have ended up being far longer than what it would have ended up being. Tabata actually spoke on this in an interview with Kotaku sometime back. I will post the Novel Crystallis link down below if you would like to take a look at that. You have to understand we were already pushing the 10-year mark waiting for this project to come out, and it's amazing that it had that much interest. So the longer that the development would have been on this game, the less likely this game would have been able to turn a profit because interest would have significantly dropped off after the 10-year mark. Also, on the same token, another thing, if these things were to have been incorporated into Final Fantasy 15, it would have more than likely been at a unsatisfactory level for a good number of people. It would have just probably been a tiny bit of information. Another thing to take into consideration is that even Final Fantasy 15, for how it came out day 1, it was already pushing disc limitations even then. To clarify more on the disc limitation point that I just made, day 1 Final Fantasy 15 for the PlayStation 4 version was already pushing over 40 gigs. I believe the Crowns update for it nearly pushed it to the 50 gigabyte limitation. With all of the content updates that have released for Final Fantasy 15 since its day 1 release, the game is well over 50 gigabytes in its entirety. With that being said, there's no way that you're going to be able to squeeze all of that content onto a single-sided 50 gigabyte Blu-ray disc. Now, there are double-sided Blu-ray discs that do exist, but they're not used for PlayStation 4 games as far as I know. If I'm wrong, I mean, please point me to some games that do use the double-sided Blu-ray disc. Some people might make the argument that, oh, well, Final Fantasy 15 just wasn't compressed that well, hence why they wouldn't have been able to, hence why they didn't get as much stuff on a disc as they could have. For those that are making that argument, we don't really have any solid evidence on that, so that's just all hypothesis. If there is any evidence, I mean, feel free to show me, because I haven't personally seen any. There are some people that have made the comment of, oh, well, you know, they could have put this on multiple Blu-ray discs. No, they could not have, because if you're thinking that this was going to be a replay of the PlayStation 1 generation to where you get multiple discs and they charge you one big price that's about the same as a single PlayStation 1 disc, we're not in that era anymore. So I guarantee you, if they would have done that to get all the content fitted on, would have been looking at least $120 product. There's no way most people would have even been able to afford that, and it would have been a turnoff for a lot of other people, even if they could afford it. So this was the best route that they could have taken, given the situation. Let's be honest here. A person's more likely to spend $5 on something than $50 on something. The more money you're having to spend on something, the higher that the risk is. That's at least my analogy with it anyways, but hey, I could always be wrong. There have been several remarks in regards to Final Fantasy 15 being made on the internet, rather it is a cash grab or it is being milked as a product. And I wanted to provide my thoughts on both of those real quick. Even before the release date of Final Fantasy 15, there was already free content being released for the title. Brotherhood episode 1 through 5 can be watched on YouTube for free. That has been like that prior to the game's release, and it still holds true today. Even up to this point in time now, there is still free content being released for Final Fantasy 15. Not everything has been paid content, and there are still plans for more free content going into the future. A few notable mentions that I would like to make real quick in regards to the free content would include the Regalia Type D, an optional boss. There has been the Chocobo Carnival, and now we currently have the Assassin's Creed Festival that's taking place. Now, if this game was truly a cash grab, all of those properties would have gotten charged for to the consumer base. Also, in regards to the comment of Final Fantasy 15 is getting milked as a product, I can somewhat understand where people are coming from on this, but I personally cannot agree with this. The reason why I personally cannot agree with this is due to the fact that a lot of people waited 10 years for this project to come out, and there's a high demand for there to be more content released in regards to Final Fantasy 15. So is it really milking when a lot of the consumer base would like to see more content going into the future? They're not simply just doing this on their own, unlike with the Final Fantasy 13 situation where there was additional content released in regards to that universe when there was not nearly as high of a demand for it.
Thought people were friendly outside the city.
Yeah, you can only go so far on the kindness of strangers.
To say Final Fantasy 15 is not a Final Fantasy game is extraordinarily disheartening. I will say that Final Fantasy 15, from what I personally experienced, does definitely take a lot of inspiration from 6 and 8, as well as several other mainline numbered games within the franchise. I want to make something clear and bring up this point to the progression of the Final Fantasy series to maybe bring light on Final Fantasy 15. As technology has continued to increase and as time has gone by, the Final Fantasy games have become more and more radically different from one another. Way back in the past, for example, Final Fantasies 1 through 3 were very similar in structure, but by the time you reach Final Fantasy 6, you start to see a lot of new things being incorporated or really being well noticed, such as the mechs. Final Fantasy 7 takes on a more sci-fi setting. Final Fantasy 8 has a more grounded reality structure. Final Fantasy 9 is more of a throwback to the really old Final Fantasy games. Final Fantasy 10 is heavily focused on religion and takes a linear design to its navigation. Final Fantasy 11 was the first online MMO. Final Fantasy 12 was pretty much a single player version of an MMO. Final Fantasy 13 took a narrative of literally us against the world, and it felt like you were pushed along a path. Final Fantasy 14 actually got rebooted from the ground up, and now we're dealing with Final Fantasy 15, the first action RPG within the mainline series. So to say the least, just going through everything quickly, we've seen a lot of radical changes, and these radical changes are going to continue to come. I'm not saying that you have to like these individual Final Fantasy games that come out, but it's important to understand and respect these differences that come out. For a game that you might not personally be interested in, another person might actually really love that game. And Final Fantasy 15 is definitely a challenger. It went back and it decided to change things up. I would say that Final Fantasy 15 would not be a Final Fantasy game if it were to have played it safe, if it were to have been a copy of a different Final Fantasy game. Final Fantasy 15 was never striving to be an exact copy of your Final Fantasy game, but the goal of Final Fantasy 15 was to maybe bring up some memories, bring up some feelings that you had when you played a prior Final Fantasy game that you really enjoyed. That's just my opinion on the case though. If you disagree, please let me know down in the comments below. Anyways, if you've watched this or listened to all this, I want to say thank you. You be safe out there. Deuces!
And let the rage of Sparta fuel your blade.